Thank you very much for the kind introduction. My title is indeed a little bit challenging, as I have to raise more questions than I will provide answers, but it's actually a fun job to do, and I'm looking forward to the next 10 minutes. These are my disclosures according to the EANM recommendations. However, none of them are really in relevance to what I'm going to discuss in the next minutes. My talk is structured to 3 parts. First of all, I want to briefly touch upon the questions which we have successfully answered in the last years. Then I want to explicitly take time to mention and discuss questions which are currently unanswered and which need to be answered, and then conclude on a short outlook for future next steps. One big question we always were confronted with in nuclear medicine was, are we really able to execute and successfully conduct phase 3 studies which are necessary to really convince our friends and colleagues from oncology? And here, this slide summarizes 2 of the most recent, very successful publications showing that indeed radioligand therapy is feasible in part of phase 3 studies to show that these therapies are superior to standard clinical therapies. On the left side, the groundbreaking NETA-1 study. This is a study showing that patients who received 4 cycles of radioligand therapy, PRT, had a significant longer progression-free survival than patients who had a high dose of cold, non-radioactive sandostatin. This study was performed in patients with neuroendocrine tumors, mainly duodenales. And what also is obviously already from the first view quite impressive is that these curves are quite different. And if you look at the hazard ratios, not mentioned here, but it is really the case that patients who did not undergo PRT had a 5 times higher likelihood to experience progression than patients who were treated with PRT. This study, published in 2017, is really the hallmark of the modern times of nuclear medicine and radioligand therapy. And on the right side, this is a study which was the results first shown at ASCO this year, and then now published in September in the New England Journal, showing a prospective phase 3 study using PSMA targeted radioligand therapy. In this case, patients in 3rd line or later, which means patients had a prior at least 1 line of novel anti-androgen and 1 line of chemotherapy, were randomized either into up to 6 cycles of PSMA radioligand therapy plus standard of care or only standard of care alone. The reason I'm mentioning it's at least 3rd line is because many of the patients already had also 3, 4, or even 5 lines before they were finally offered participation in this trial. And here, when we look at the overall survival, which is highly relevant in a tumor like prostate cancer, we can see that indeed the median is 15.3 months compared to 11.3 months. And the hazard ratio of 0.62 is something which is really, as our colleagues from urology and uro-oncology say, indeed has the potential to be a game changer. So this is one of the questions successfully answered. We are able to conduct phase 3 studies prospectively, which are necessary to really be accepted on the level of oncologists and other clinicians. A second important question is, once we conduct these trials, are we also able to really cross the finish line and get approval from the authorities? On the left side, this was based on the NETA-1 study, indeed, the FDA approval, and then a little bit later, the EMA approval of Lutathera, the lutetium-177 dotatate by Novartis and AAA. And this is FDA approved and EMA approved and available. And on the right side, at least the announcement from FDA that there is priority review granted for lutetium PSMA-617 in mCRPC, and we expect FDA approval and EMA approval in 2022. Another big question always was that is there really money to be made in the field of nuclear medicine and radioligand therapy? And again, first of all, this is not showing that money was being made. This mainly shows that the money was able to be raised. But we know that Wall Street is obviously very often much smarter than many of us. And you can see that in the last 4 or 5 years, there has been quite a lot of money influx into the space. And obviously, the 2 highlight transaction was the $3.9 billion acquisition of Novartis, done by Novartis of AAA, and the same one for $2.1 billion than Novartis acquiring Endocyte. But many others also show that indeed there is a quite interest in, from a business point per view, and usually they only invest money if this is a quite reasonable business opportunity. Now, the second part, I want to focus on the questions which are currently not answered yet, and we have to answer in the future. So one big challenge is going to be, is nuclear medicine and Theranostics actually ready for scale-up? Like mentioned before, the data for PSMA 617 looks very promising. We expect approval in early and late 2022, depending if it's FDA or EMA. And we also know from the numbers that we expect a significant increase in patient referral and overall demand. And now, are we able to really meet the expectation? Are we able to meet the demand? Many countries are not really ready for the rollout. One big question mark, obviously, it's US, because nuclear medicine overall is not very strong there traditionally in the last years. Also, France, UK, strong countries, also countries with strong nuclear medicine, but do they have the means and the trained personnel to really scale up the Theranostics centers to meet the demand by patients? Another big question is who's going to administer radioligand therapy. Of course, in certain countries where you have a strong nuclear medicine department and infrastructure, they will try to keep their hands on the therapy. But the big question is what's going to happen in the US. Is it going to be radiation oncology? Is it going to be oncology? Or is nuclear medicine finding its way to grow? One of the big questions which has to be solved. Even in Germany, where we have a strong tradition of nuclear medicine and we already have an experience of applying radioligand therapy, I'm not 100% sure if we really have enough Theranostics centers and also sufficient trained personnel to meet the demand, which we will see once PSMA 617 is approved and many other new therapies are coming, hopefully soon. One hope is that obviously a collaboration of EANM, SNMI, and IEAR together, that they will be able to tackle this issue, what I like to call the issue of the last mile, obviously taking this comparison of logistics, but it's not only important to get the medication approved, to get it distributed to the site, but make sure that the patient really gets access to this medication. Another set of question is if the business model I showed you before is really sustainable. We know that the history, when we look back into the history, that Civil and Bexa were unfortunately, despite being really very potent and successful drugs, financial failures. We also know that Xofigo, which is a drug which includes radium-223, which has shown one of the most promising and first phase 3 studies with significant survival benefit of patients, in date was not as commercially as successful as really expected. And for example, in Germany, one of the problems could have been that the people who administered the treatment, that they were not reimbursed adequately. So for example, the money which was actually behind the procedure was only 2% of the drug costs. So this obviously is a challenge, and if we do not solve this for the future, then this might not be a sustainable model. Another thing is that PRT, the rollout, and when you look at the numbers, was not as fast as expected. And the big question is why? Is it because there were not enough people who are really willing to apply the treatment, or was it rather that the people who are controlling the patient and the patient flow were not aware or not willing to refer the patients for PRT? So it's one of the challenges we have to obviously tackle in the future as well. And a big question is, this is how do we make sure that we incentivize the person who is leading the patient? How can we make sure that he really refers the patient to us who administer the radioligand therapy? And another big issue overall, if you look at the cost of goods and the logistical complexity of radioligand therapy, it is obviously more complex and more troublesome than, for example, of just producing pills and distributing them without a half-life. One big question also is Theranostics indeed platform technology, or is it just a one-hit wonder as PRT and PSMA? As for example, when you look at the songs of Rick Astley, who had 2 really world-class songs, but then nothing else happened. Another question is we are very often sure that radioligand therapy is very simple. You only need a specific ligand, then you use a chelator and you combine it with a radionuclide. And this looks a little bit like it's plug and play, but is it really just plug and play? It's probably much more complex. And can we transfer this system to other opportunities. And then a big demand and question is, so far, mainly peptides and small molecules have been successful. Can we expand beyond to biologics, to single-strand antibodies, to full antibodies? And of course, also, can we take advantage of the large libraries available for both peptides, but also antibodies? And only then we can really confirm that Theranostics is a platform technology. And the big question is, what comes next after PSMA? I think the benchmark is set by both the DOTATATE as well as the PSMA 617, and what are the next big things coming? Here, this slide just summarizes you 4 potential opportunities. For example, here the gallium-68 labeled imaging agent for expression of CXCR4, or the currently very popular FAP agent here also labeled with gallium-68, or is it the GRPR receptor, in this case NEO-B as an imaging compound, or another target, the carboanhydrase 9, here in this case a zirconium version of the girentuximab. Overall, there are many new promising targets and diagnostic concepts currently around, but the big question is which of them is really making it to the approval and to the exception and translation into the clinical routine. Well, I have now raised, as promised, many questions. How can we really answer the question? Because many of the questions have to be answered to successfully and sustainable develop radioligand therapy. Well, one thing is, and this is very important, is that academia industry, we really have to join forces. Otherwise, we're not able to successfully scale up the currently approved and soon to be approved therapies. Reimbursement remains a huge challenge, and this is something we really have to pay attention to, and we also have to make sure that we have enough trained workforce to make sure that we really meet the demand and the challenge of the last mile. It's also important with many new radioligand therapy concepts around the corner to establish a clear translation and clinical pathway to make this faster, easier, and cheaper. And a big challenge, obviously, is that we have to go beyond nuclear medicine with Theranostics and also to go beyond oncology. For example, very exciting applications in the cardiac, but also in the inflammatory field, for example, for FAP imaging, but maybe also for FAP-directed therapy. And like I said before, and I'm very happy that I was able to give a talk at this meeting here, Europe has always been so far the driver of Theranostics to make sure that we stay behind the steering wheel and that we are the ones really driving the innovation of Theranostics in Europe. For this, the NMEU is a very important catalysator, and I'm very grateful for having the opportunity to talk here, and I'm very looking forward to the discussion. Thank you.